The church is a meeting place between heaven and earth, creator and created, savior and pilgrim. While over the centuries we have attempted to capture the divine with our religious structures, our songs have bared our souls. Every Sunday, millions of people around the globe will join together in singing praise to God. This expression of faith in song is part of the Christian heritage of black and white, rich and poor, young and old. Some sing from heavy hearts, others in joyful celebration. Whether the singing is simple or sophisticated, these songs were meant to be sung from the heart. Hymns appear in over 200 different languages and in virtually every denomination. These songs extend beyond the boundaries of the choir loft and stained glass window. Hymns are embedded in the human experience. They underscore and accent common moments of life. Hymns bring to mind childhood experiences. They evoke memories of a loved one or the suffering and resurrection of the Savior. They even articulate the cry of a generation. Underneath the poems and melodies of these beloved songs lie incredible stories of faith, where deepest human emotion is met with divine comfort. In uncovering the events and inspiration behind these hymns, you'll never listen to them passively again. Understanding their history breathes new life, hope, and comfort into these familiar songs. Typically, we sing these great hymns in peaceful settings, far removed from their passionate beginnings. In stark contrast, many of these hymns were forged in the furnace of great trial. This is where our reacquaintance to them begins.
In the early 17th century, the industry of slave trade flourished under the influence of the powerful English merchant class. But in both English government and society in general, slavery was silently looked upon as a viable trade. The Newton family of Wapping, England, had long been merchants and mariners. Captain Newton determined that his only child, John, would continue the family tradition and make a career of the sea. Elizabeth Newton, however, planned for her son to attend St. Andrews University in Scotland and become a minister. Early on, John showed an interest in music. He enjoyed his mother's church, where they sang the new hymns of Isaac Watts in chorus, like sailors' shanties. Her active role in his life was limited to teaching, for she was often bedridden for days at a time. Elizabeth Newton was slowly succumbing to tuberculosis. She died just before John's 7th birthday. After only 2 years, John quit school to join his father on his voyages. The life of the sea was one of hardship and worldliness. From his religious upbringing, he would soon stray. In 1743, Britain entered the War of Austrian Succession against the French. The Royal Navy scoured the ports of England looking for merchant sailors to force into service. Newton was not interested in military service. The object of his affection was the young Miss Polly Catlett. Longtime family friends, the Catlets invited John to spend Christmas with them. After an extended stay of several months, he was discovered by the Royal Navy and, against his will, taken onto a Navy ship. He was held prisoner until they legally enlisted him, after which disappearance would mean desertion. The Navy ship was not scheduled to return for 5 years. Unable to endure the loss of freedom and possibly his true love, Newton deserted. He was captured within days. Death was the sure penalty for desertion. Unknown to Newton, his father intervened in his behalf. He was publicly stripped and beaten, but instead of execution, he was put back in the Navy ship and demoted to the lowest rank of an ordinary sailor despite his skill and heritage of a seafaring family. As he sailed from England, he realized he had lost his chance of life and love. He was overcome with rage and revenge. His boyhood belief in God began to wane in the face of circumstance, challenge, and ridicule. Newton made a desperate plea to the ship's officers to be exchanged onto an African merchant ship. The new ship was owned by a successful trader and bound for Guinea. There were fortunes to be made in sea trade, especially when trading strong, productive men and women to further industry and colonization for England. Newton became a typical slaver, branding the men and women, putting them in irons, forcing them into airless holds below for shipping. At 20 years old, Newton had grown into an angry young man, his rage commonly vented on the frightened, sick, and innocent cargo. The men were beaten, the women raped. He was reckless, rebellious, and disrespectful to anyone from slave woman to ship captain. Newton used his musical talents developed in childhood to undermine the authority of the captain. He composed witty and demeaning songs and taught them to the crew. But when an intolerant new captain took over, Newton sought employment directly with the ship's owner, an Englishman by the name of Clough. The alliance with Clough proved profitable at first, but after a short time Newton fell out of favor with him. Irons were put on his legs, and he was forced to work in the fields as a slave, side by side with the men and women he had once traded. Suffering from exposure, tropical sickness, and malnutrition, Newton was no longer the brazen youth of the Navy or the proud son of a well-respected sea captain. He was a broken and dying man. Eventually, he was sold to another trader. His fortune began to change. Despite his experience as a slave, the atrocities he committed against the people he traded continued. His heart was cold. An associate of Newton's father was anchored in the African town where he was living. The captain found Newton and persuaded him to return to England with him. A second chance at a life he once knew seemed appealing. Newton boarded the ship bound for England. The captain extended a warm welcome, offering him food and lodging on a par with his own. In response, Newton was ungrateful and disrespectful to both crew and captain. His incessant blasphemy aimed at both God and the English Parliament was almost more than the captain could stand. Despite his sailing experience, Newton never offered any assistance during the entire year-long voyage home. While still at sea, a gale rose. The vessel, weakened from months in the tropics, was not seaworthy. The ship was in danger of sinking. Like many sailors of that time, Newton could not swim. After hours of struggle to rescue the ship, the desperate Newton dreaded his inevitable death. Finally, against all probability, it seemed as if the ship would survive. For the first time since he was a boy, Newton considered the possible work of God on his behalf. Days and nights of aimless floating with no food became the backdrop for an intense spiritual search. Newton began reading the New Testament. He discovered that Christ would forgive his sordid past, and he vowed to change his ways. After landing in England, a changed Newton was offered a position on another slave ship. In a short time, he was again found in the heart of slave trading and contributing to its abuses. While on business in Africa, Newton fell ill with a deadly fever. As death drew near, again he cried out to God. Miraculously, the fever broke, and within 2 days he returned to the ship in good health. Newton returned to England and immediately sought what was most important to him. He was persistent in his pursuit of the hand of Polly Catlett. They were married on February 1st, 1750. Within 3 months, he departed on his own slave ship for Africa. Newton's newfound commitment to God was evidenced in the more humane treatment of the people he was transporting. He was quoted as saying, "During the time I engaged in slave trade, I never had the least scruple as to its lawfulness, but slowly he began to realize the evil of this accepted profession." In 1754, John Newton arrived in an English port and never returned to slavery again. The seeds within him, planted by his mother, had begun to take root. Newton was frequently asked to recount his conversion story in various church services. His friends suggested he join the clergy. And so, after years of study, his mother's dream came true. John Newton became a minister, taking a church in the town of Olney. Here, from the repentant heart of a wretched slave trader, came the words that would become a hymn and later an anthem to a world in need of the same amazing grace he himself had experienced.
In his later years, John Newton joined forces with William Wilberforce, the prominent anti-slavery crusader, and exposed the evils of this foul profession. Newton was extremely active in abolition, and this former slave trader, saved by amazing grace, proved to be a vital force in the long campaign to outlaw this crime against humanity. Around the abolition campaign of Newton's comrade, William Wilberforce, a group known as the Claphams was formed. Out of these was Henry Van Elliott. Elliott had a granddaughter who was left crippled after a bout with disease. Once a vibrant young woman, gifted in both fine art and writing, Charlotte Elliott had retreated from her family, from the world, and from God. Out of her despair, she would contribute one of the most powerful hymns ever written, an invitation to millions to come just as they are.
Charlotte Elliott was an artist at the bloom of her career when she was struck by a disease that left her paralyzed and unable to continue with her work.
Here, kitty, kitty. Who let that cat in here? Come here, you wretched creature. Mrs. Wood, where are you? Stupid, stupid cat. Come here.
Forgive me, Miss Elliott. With the dinner, I didn't hear you calling. I would have come immediately. Please, let me help.
You are of little help, I can assure you.
I'm so sorry, Miss Elliott.
Keep that animal away from my work.
You're never in there anymore.
It's wasted space.
Well, let us have a moment of prayer. Dr. Madden, would you be so good as to join us?
My pleasure.
It was to mellow the soul of his talented daughter that Charles Elliott had invited a guest to dinner, the noted minister and musician who was one of the most respected names in hymnology, Dr. Cesar Mallon.
Thank you, Mrs. Wood. Charlotte, the bread, dear? Ellen, help your sister.
I don't need your help.
Charlotte. Ellen?
Sit down. We wouldn't want any wasted space.
Excuse me.
I said sit down. The Reverend Henry Elliott, always the Good Samaritan. Please, don't worry yourself about me. This cripple can take care of herself. Bread?
Charlotte, remember our guest. Dr. Madden, I apologize.
You're tired of yourself, aren't you? Are you at peace with God, Miss Elliott?
Can I bear children? Can I paint? Can I so much as wash my clothes? I am relegated to a life of torture. God is the jester and I'm his cruel joke. What have you to say to that, Dr. Mallon?
You need the faith you're trying to despise.
You know nothing about what I need.
Dr. Mallon, may I speak with you for a moment?
Of course.
Later, Charlotte apologized to Dr. Mallon for her behavior at dinner. She told him of her despair and her desire to lead a different life.
Do you really think God would want someone like me? I don't know that I could ever be good enough to become a Christian.
Miss Elliot, none of us are good enough.
But I can't change.
You give yourself to God just as you are now, with your pride and shame, fears and hates. He would take them, Miss Elliot, and put his great love in their place. Come just as you are, Miss Elliot. Just as you are.
Each year, on the anniversary of their conversation, Charlotte Elliott received a letter from Dr. Mallon challenging her just as he had that night in Brighton. Years later, the Elliots were busily raising funds to build a college for underprivileged women. Unable to participate, Charlotte was left at home again, faced with her feelings of inadequacy. She expressed them in a poem. It began with the very words spoken to her by Dr. Mallon on that fateful evening 14 years before.
Just as I am is as loved today as it was over 100 years ago. It has brought freedom for thousands to come just as they are to a holy, loving God. Just as I am has been the theme of the powerful work of Reverend Billy Graham, who has shared the same message in his many national and international crusades throughout the years. This song separates religion's demands for perfection from the love of Jesus, who receives us just as we are. Tragedy is a part of life, and when it hits, there's hardly anything that can bring solace in a time of great sorrow. Yet out of overwhelming feelings of irretrievable loss, a hymn of great comfort was written for the entire world.
The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 had left thousands destitute, wiping out over 2,000 acres of property, reducing 17,000 buildings to ashes, and causing the damages of over $200 million, the equivalent of $2.3 billion today. 300 people were killed, over 98,000 were left homeless. Among those suffering financial disaster by the blaze was Horatio Spafford, a real estate owner with extensive holdings on the north shore of Lake Michigan. Spafford and his wife had 5 children, 4 girls, Maggie, Tanetta, Annie, and Bessie, and 1 son whose death from scarlet fever they were still grieving when the fire struck. The mental and physical duress was taking a toll on the family. A friend of Spafford's, Reverend Dwight L. Moody, was scheduled to preach in England. The Spaffords decided that attending the meetings in England would be an excellent opportunity for the entire family to travel and vacation with friends. Due to business commitments, Spafford sent his wife and daughters ahead with intentions to follow soon after. The Ville du Havre was one of the most luxurious boats in the French fleet. The sailing vessels of John Newton's day had given way to the steam engine. Wooden hulls were replaced with iron, and the Spartan living berths and galleys were replaced with elegant cabins and spacious dining rooms done in ornate Victorian style. Days before boarding the Ville du Havre, a last-minute premonition caused Spafford to change the location of his family's cabin forward to the bow of the vessel. Saying goodbye and promising to join them within a few weeks, Spafford watched them board the ship. A few hours after midnight, on November 22, 1873, on a quiet sea still several days from port, the luxury liner was struck by an English iron sailing vessel. The Lochern rammed the Ville du Havre at 2 a.m. The damage was too much for the liner to sustain. Within 12 minutes, it was underwater. In 2 hours, the massive ship had settled to the ocean floor. 226 lives were lost, including all 4 of the Spafford girls. Too young and weak to withstand the ocean currents, they drowned in the frigid waters. Mrs. Spafford, however, was rescued 9 days later landed with the other survivors in Cardiff, Wales. After this time of isolation with her memory of the tragedy, Mrs. Spafford sent a message to her husband. The cablegram contained only 2 words: saved alone. The death of his only son, the destruction of his thriving business, and now the devastation of losing his 4 precious little girls. Instead of collapsing under such horrific circumstances, Spafford demonstrated a remarkable, unswaying faith in the face of a mysterious God. I am glad to trust the Lord when it will cost something. Horatio Spafford. Immediately, he booked a passage on a ship to Europe to join his wife. The cold December journey was long and undoubtedly gave him many uninterrupted hours of thought. Late one night, the captain of the ship called Spafford into his cabin. I believe we are now passing over the place where the Vio de Havre went down, he told him. Somewhere in the vast waters of the Atlantic was the watery grave of his beloved children. One can hardly imagine the grief flooding a father's heart at the thought of his helpless daughters struggling for life in the icy ocean. Spafford returned to his cabin. That night he was unable to sleep. He arose from his bed, and out of unfathomable heartbreak he penned the words that would bring comfort to many hurting souls, starting with his own. When peace like a river attendeth my way, and sorrow like sea billows roll, whatever my lot has taught me to say, it is well with my soul.
Horatio Spafford settled in Israel in 1881. There the Spaffords founded an orphanage in Jerusalem. The Spafford Clinic was born out of the pain of parents who no longer had their children, to love children who no longer had their parents. From its inception, the Christian faith has incorporated the singing of hymns as a part of worship. The Israelites gave us ancient songs of celebration. David penned the Psalms. The apostles sang hymns while in prison. But hymns also have something to offer those who may not consider themselves saintly. For the authors of these hymns weren't always churchgoers. They were ordinary people that in the midst of great need cried out to God and received the salvation and hope they so desperately desired. this age of change and instability, we can cling to these Psalms of our times. We can confidently face tragedy, hardship, and trials, secure in knowing our prayers are heard by a loving God. He is acting on our behalf with the miracle we need or the strength to endure. For it is by amazing grace that we can come just as we are to God and assuredly proclaim, "It is well with my soul."